Thank you, girls. If I can have your attention here now. I'd just like to begin by really commending you for the way that you've come into the space and for being here during common time on a Wednesday afternoon, when I certainly know, working with the girls in my class, this is a busy time of the year for you all. We're really hopeful that this afternoon will be a really rich experience for you. We've got a panel of people who are old and newer friends, and we're delighted to have them here with us today. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing introductions. As you all came in, you would have gotten a sheet of paper that hopefully for some of you will already have looked familiar from the classwork that you've been doing. This panel is going to really assist you with your assessment task. So we would really strongly encourage you during this time to be really listening and taking some great notes, and also seizing the opportunity to ask some questions. Each of the panellists come with just an incredible wealth of experience and wisdom to offer. I know for myself, specifically when I'm working in an area where I'm not speaking from a Catholic tradition, I am incredibly grateful to our panellists who've come along who can share from their faith tradition about the treatment and processing of asylum seekers here in Australia. So I'll introduce you very briefly to the panel. We have Ite, who's going to speak with us first, who's a teacher in a Jewish school and who teaches RNS there. So we welcome him and look forward to hearing from him. And Tashneem is our Islamic speaker who is joining us, and we're really grateful. You can YouTube her and find a really great clip on her, which I did, so maybe after today you might like to do that. And then we have Jill, who is an engaged Buddhist and a wonderfully committed woman who's come directly this morning from Foundation House to join us. So she's been working with asylum seekers and refugees this morning. And then we have Bridget Arthur, who's a Brigidine nun and in the Catholic world is one of the most wise and amazing women who has given so much of her life and energy to asylum seekers and refugees. So I'm going to hand over to Ite first to share, and the panel's going to come down because he's got a PowerPoint to share with us. Thanks. Girls, make the panel welcome.
So thank you very much for having me. In Hebrew I would say shalom, which means hello, and it's lovely to be here to teach students whose work I don't have to assess. So thank you very much for inviting me. There are many Jewish views on asylum seekers, and it's impossible for me to give all of them, so I'm only going to give one of them. But the reason I'm stating this is because we are a very diverse community and we don't agree on anything, especially something as heated and divisive as this. So just want to make that disclaimer that this is simply my view based on my knowledge and learning, not the entire view of the community. So I want to start off with my family story. My mother was born in Baghdad in Iraq, a city that's obviously in the news a lot at the moment, and that's my mother there. And they were part of a very long Jewish community that lived in Iraq for thousands of years, and their lives turned over in 1950, where together with almost the entire Jewish community of Iraq, they left for Palestine, and they were one of over 900,000 Jews that did live in Muslim countries that, for various reasons, did move during that period of history. When they came to Palestine, a lot of them lived in tents that look like this, and today they look like this, and they are very much alive today because they had a place to go after what happened post-World War II. On my father's side, this is my grandmother, and they were from Germany. They also lived in Germany for hundreds of years, and in 1926, there was a book written called Mein Kampf by Adolf Hitler, and that book outlined Hitler's plan for what he wanted to do to the Jewish people. And as those ideas became more well-known and more common in Germany, obviously the Jewish community started facing more attacks. There were more attacks on synagogues and shops. And one of the shops that was attacked was my grandmother's shop. She had a furniture store at that time. And in 1933, when Hitler was elected and came to power, my grandmother sensed what was about to happen, and she also decided to leave Germany. She was 19 at that time. She was the only one in her family that did leave, and the rest of her family that stayed there didn't survive World War II. So the idea of having to flee due to a terrible tragedy is something that I have very much on both sides of my family. As you can see here, many German Jews left Germany before World War II. Once World War II began, it became very difficult to leave Germany. But the way they left Germany, as you can see from this map, is on boats. Those that didn't leave, unfortunately, were killed in a very horrible way, and I'm sure you've learnt about the Holocaust when you've learnt about World War II, and it's not something I need to tell you about how traumatic that was for my people at that time, and it still is today in many ways. So my grandmother came again to Palestine in 1933, to this place here called Hamadia, and again this is me and her family today in Israel. There was a very large number of illegal immigration when Palestine was under the British mandate of Jews trying to flee Europe at that time, because a lot of Jews were feeling that it was not safe to be in Europe, and they were doing all that they could to flee and to run for their lives. I want to tell you the story of two boats that I think, for me at least, resonate very strongly to how I form my opinion today. The first is a boat called the Strummer. I don't know if many people have heard of it. It's not a very well-known story, but this was a boat in 1942 that had 800 Jews fleeing Romania. This was during when the Holocaust had already began, and those Jews were again trying to get to Palestine at that time. They weren't allowed entry under the British rules at that time, and that boat was eventually hit by a Russian missile, and everyone on that boat had drowned. And so again, when I talk about where do you go when you're on a boat and where's a safe place to go, the memory of the Strummer is something that is very strong for me. But the boat that actually resonates with me even stronger is one called the MS St. Louis. It's a very famous ship that in 1939 was carrying 937 German Jews. They boarded the boat. First they went to Cuba, then they went to the United States, and then they went to Canada. All three countries did not accept that boat, and eventually the boat was sent back to Europe. We know that at least 1 in 4 people who were on that boat were killed during the war. So again, this is very much my family history, and this is very much how I've come to form my views. When you're on a boat that is turned away and it doesn't have a place to go, unfortunately, I know what happens to those people. In 1951, as a result of stories like the St. Louis and the Strummer, there was something called the UN Refugee Convention, which I'm sure your teachers have taught you about, which was formed to prevent incidents like that happening, prevent boats reaching ports and being turned around. That UN convention says quite clearly, no contracting state shall expel or return a refugee. So that if someone does get on a boat and tries to reach another country, that their claims will be assessed, that they won't be returned to where they came from, because we don't want a repeat of what happened during World War II. As you can see here, all the countries in green and yellow have signed the Refugee Convention, but a very large number of them, who all seem to be surrounding Australia, have not signed that Refugee Convention, which relates to the situation we have at the moment. Today, there are more refugees in the world than any time in history since World War II. The number is now 51 million. The tragedy of what's happening in Syria has obviously caused millions of refugees, and the more I watch from there, the more I cry about the terrible suffering that's happening there, Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of conflict in war at the moment that causes people to be displaced. In terms of a Jewish response to what I've told you up until now, there is a verse in the Torah, or what you would refer to as the Old Testament, and it says, "V'ger lo tilchet v'atem yadatem et nefesh hager ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim." Do not oppress the stranger, for you know the feelings of the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. Now, of all the verses in the Torah, that is repeated the most amount of times. It's repeated 36 times. Just to put that in context, keeping kosher, which is the food we eat, that's said 3 times. So if you imagine this is said 36 times, you can imagine that the Torah is very clear about having a very clear rule about not oppressing the stranger because of our historical experience. In this case, it's talking about the slavery in Egypt when we were slaves to Pharaoh. But today, obviously, that has a very different connotation. And the Chama Leibovitz, which is a biblical scholar, she would say, why is this the most repeated injunction in the Torah? Because we are bidden to put ourselves in the position of the stranger by remembering how it was when we were strangers in another land. Today, when we remember the Exodus from Egypt, there's a festival called Passover or Pesach, and every year we have a meal to mark that, and there's certain foods that we eat and songs where we tell the story of how Moses took us out of Egypt. And one of the things that we say in that ritual is Bechol dor vador chayav adam. In every generation, one must regard himself as if he had personally come out of Egypt. So there's a notion of becoming free every year, and that's a very central festival in the Jewish calendar. And I know when I have a Pesach Seder with my family, one of the things we always talk about is who is not free this year, who is the Pharaoh this year, and how are we going to help those people become free. So what that leads me to is, what is the Jewish view on this issue? In the last minute that I have, the Rabbinical Council of Victoria, which is the representative of Orthodox Judaism, they released a statement in 2013 where they said how they felt about, this was the week after Kevin Rudd had announced the PNG solution, and they said that whilst we are mindful of the need to have secure borders, the safety of asylum seekers and the cost of integrating asylum seekers into the community, Jewish teaching and our own historical experience, referring to those boats that I told you about, informs us that these considerations cannot and must not override our ethical and moral obligation to help the stranger. Again, it's not an accident that they use the word that stranger. That, for us, is our historical echo of what happened to us in Egypt. And if it was wrong for Pharaoh to do that to us in Egypt, it's probably wrong for it to happen today. Thank you.
I'm now going to hand over to Jill. Thank you very much for your wonderful perspective from the Jewish perspective and giving us a bigger picture. And over to Jill.
Yes, well, thank you, Itay. And really good to be here to share with you a little about the Buddhist tradition and how some of this might relate to working with asylum seekers. And although Buddhism is diverse, there are many different strands, I will mainly be talking from my own experience, meditation practice in the Zen Buddhist tradition, and we'll just mention a few of the teachings that might be relevant to working with asylum seekers. Firstly, meditation practice. In Buddhism, the Buddha actually means the awakened one. And there's not so much, it's the study of the mind is the basis of our practice. And so through meditation and mindfulness practice, we come to have insights into who we are and how we respond to issues in the world. So through meditation practice, it's a way of realising our inner nature, our true inner nature, which we call Buddha nature, but all the different traditions have a name for this. It's something, although it's beyond a name, it's really part of the mystery. And And through this experience of meditation, we come to touch our interconnectedness of how we are connected with all beings, regardless, and in fact with all of life. And if we're connected with all of life, then we have a very strong connection and feeling, just as Itai talked about the stranger. It's like putting ourselves in the shoes of the other to understand or to directly experience what is happening for the other. And through this experience, it's to know and acknowledge the beauty and love within, and which of course is with others as well. And to see that in this way all people are equal, because we all have this inner beauty, love within us. So in the peace building training that I do with some members from communities at Foundation House from Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq and Burma, we map conflicts, and to see into our own, and this, by mapping the conflict, we look first of all into our own needs and fears, and then into the needs and fears of the other. And in this way, it's a way of stepping into the shoes to feel the pain, the suffering of the other. So, and in that way, it can change the way we relate to others, and especially, for example, towards asylum seekers, with respect, with dignity, with loving kindness. Another aspect of our interconnectedness was talked about in a poem by a Vietnamese Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, who talked of his poem called "Please Call Me By My True Names," where he saw and suggested in that poem that we are both the pirate in the seas, the 12-year-old girl who was raped, because we just don't know. If we had been born in another country at another time, we might have been driven to do the same sort of things. We rarely get to know the stories of asylum seekers or even see pictures of them as people. Rather, the focus of policy has been on deterrence, rather than a policy based on humanitarian protection. If we all have Buddha nature within, or whatever religion calls this, we are all equal. But policies are unequal. There's much discrimination. And a policy towards punishment of asylum seekers, such as the 20,000 asylum seekers who are on bridging visas with no right to work. And so they have lost an important way of being able to, for a sense of self-worth and dignity. This presents an opportunity to help the lives of many asylum seekers who are already in Australia, who are already Australia's responsibility. There's no point now in extending the suffering and the punishment for those detained, and it's a short-sighted approach for those who, most of the people will be given refugee status and who will be Australian citizens. One of the main teachings within all the different Buddhist traditions is the Four Noble Truths, which was the Buddha's first teaching after his enlightenment. The first Noble Truth is that there is suffering. And although there's suffering, we all have affected by suffering, pain and mental anguish, it is clear that asylum seekers have more than their fair share of deep suffering. The second Noble Truth is that there's a cause to this suffering, and due to our grasping, clinging and aversion, or what is mine or other. For example, my country, which allows in certain types of new arrivals who can pay their way by air, but not those who come by boat. But if we look even at the fairly obvious causes and ask, and this doesn't seem to be very often happen, why are asylum seekers coming here? What are the causes? And if we find that some of those coming from Iraq and Syria Iraq and Afghanistan, for example, come because of war, because of increased poverty, from trauma, and some of this can be traced back to Australia's support for the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. This has destabilised the country and contributed to the associated ongoing violence. And this points to us. I mean, what way are we implicated as a result of our involvement? What responsibility do we have towards people as a result of what has happened there? If we can come to understand some of the causes of why people flee, there may be some ways to modify or change. The third one is the end of suffering. There's a way out. And in the context of asylum seekers, this points to the need to explore possibilities for prevention, how to support people from a humanitarian aid perspective. From experience of mine working in the Horn of Africa and Cambodia and Vietnam, seeing how, for example, small loan programs, how to be able to shift the situation of poverty, how to support people, as well as providing peace-building training, working to be able to overcome some of the conflict areas to prevent perhaps people moving, providing more opportunities for asylum seekers. And fourthly, the fourth noble truth is the path or skillful means. There are a number of aspects of this, such as right view and understanding, basically that we're not separate from others and are interconnected, my brother or sister's keeper. We thus have a responsibility individually and as a whole towards offering a safe haven and care for those who've experienced deep suffering. In a Buddhist approach, the core of practice, rather than prayer to a deity to intervene, there's vows that we often recite. And the first part is, though the many beings are numberless, I vow to liberate them. Now that sounds huge, but we start with ourselves. If I have a peaceful heart, there's probably more likely to be peace around me. Yes, not letting my own stuff to get in the way, taking responsibility for whatever arises. For example, listening deeply to the stories of the refugees that I work with from Afghanistan and Syria at Foundation House, and the stories of political prisoners that I work with in Myanmar, experiencing their pain as a way to open the heart with compassion and find the way just presenting itself. Perhaps the most basic way to a Buddhist approach is in one word, non-violence. And the Dalai Lama often says, do good, but if you can't do good, at least do no harm. This brings the focus on the plight of asylum seekers, not the result of stopping the boats. So there are many other different approaches, but I think the most basic one is to be able to see see asylum seekers as people, and to touch that suffering, and to, with heart open and compassion, to see how to respond. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now invite Bridget to share with us from a Catholic perspective.
Okay, thank you. Does this pick up my voice?
Yes.
Okay, just does it. Okay, thank you. I guess the first point that I want to make is that being kind and compassionate to other people is really a decent thing to do, irrespective of faith tradition. It's a decent thing when we actually look after each other. I just go back to a couple of instances in my own childhood. I lived on a farm up in close to the South Australian border, And two men used to often call at our farm. One was a man who sold ointments and I guess some kinds of medicine, but the thing I remember mainly was ointment, because everybody bought Rawley's ointment from this, and we called the man Mr. Rawley. I'm sure that wasn't his name. He was a salesman for this particular company. But he always came to our place at lunchtime, and that became quite a joke, because going from farm to farm to farm to farm, he just would always get to our place at lunchtime. And why did he? My father used to say, because he knows you'll get a good lunch here, which he did. My mother would invite him in. The other man who came had a horse, and he pulled a haberdashery sort of van. I don't know what nationality he was. Maybe he was Indian, maybe he was Afghani. We used to call him Rhubarb. I'm sure that wasn't his name either. But he would come in the evening because my father would let his horse go in the paddock and stay there, and Mum would give him hot water. That's the only thing I remember him asking for. I'm sure they didn't sit down, both of my parents were Catholics, but I'm sure they didn't sit down and think, well, as Catholics now, what should we do? They did that to those two men and to my mother in particular, to many other people in the district, because it was the decent thing to do. So that's my first point. And it's a decent thing to do, and we have a faith tradition as Catholics, as Christians, that actually supports that kind of being decent. And we're not alone in this. All, I think, other faith traditions have that same kind of, it's good to be kind and compassionate to those in need. We have different stories that tradition comes out of. That's the difference, really, the different traditions. Our tradition goes back partly to the Jewish tradition. So we come from a Judeo-Christian background because Jesus was Jewish. And our Jewish tradition is part of what Itar, I'm going to get it right, sorry, was talking about. You know, be kind to the widow, the orphan and the stranger. That's a phrase that comes in so many times to what we call the Old Testament or the First Testament. And do things like don't take every last olive if you're collecting the olives from the where they grow, whatever olive grove, because the widow, the orphan, and the stranger will be coming along and they'll be looking for something to eat. So there's many things like that, and I love the one that Itya spoke about too. Be good to the stranger. Remember what it was like to be a stranger yourselves. You know, that's powerful, I think. And then we have the next part of our tradition, our Christian tradition, is the Jesus story. And Jesus was extraordinarily powerful when he talked about looking after people who were on the outside. In fact, more than anything else in the Gospels, it's the outsiders and Jesus going to the outsiders that takes prominence in the story. So the outsiders were people like the Samaritans. They were seen to be unclean. All sorts of people were outsiders. It's amazing how many outsiders they managed to find. But if you did certain jobs, you were an outsider. If you were sick, you were an outsider. If you were mentally ill, you were an outsider. And Jesus spent a lot of his time bringing in the outsiders and saying, look, I mean, in my mind, he didn't actually say this, but in my mind he's saying, they're human beings. They're human beings, and we mustn't divide ourselves up into insiders and outsiders. So he tells stories like the Good Samaritan. That runs off our tongue like, you know, very easily. But in Jesus' time, it was an absolute anomaly to talk about a Good Samaritan. There were no such things as Good Samaritans. Samaritans were unclean and not to be trusted and, well, not to have anything to do with, really. So the fact that a Samaritan came along and picked up the fella who'd been left for dead, I mean, that would have shocked Jesus' audience. They would have said, come on, it would be another one of our own people who'd look after this man, not a Samaritan. So, you know, we have parables like that. The Good Shepherd, where it's against all conventional wisdom to leave 99 sheep. If you come from a farm, it's against everything that you'd hold sensible. to leave 99 to go looking for a one dumb sheep that managed to get lost. But that's what the parable's about. You know, find this one. And that's a parable for Jesus saying, we've got to find the people on the outside. Now that's in stark contrast, as Jill's been saying too. Both of our speakers has been saying, in stark contrast to some of the stuff that we do to asylum seekers. And we can talk about that afterwards. If we go on, and just one more thing about the Gospels. I mean, the Gospels sort of in one way they culminate in the death of Jesus and the resurrection. But in another way they culminate in Matthew 25, which says, where there's a whole big long parable where people ask Jesus, well, how will we know? How will we know when we're on the right side? And Jesus says, you're on the right side and you'll meet me if you feed the people who are hungry, look after the people who are strangers, go and visit the people who are in prisons, and so on. You'll know. That's where I will be. So that's a very powerful kind of parable about where we find our inspiration. Just talk briefly about the church's teaching. You know, some of the things when I was a kid, I don't think you learn this anymore, but when I was a kid we used to have a little catechism. And I know you don't have catechisms anymore, but one of our things one of my things as a child was you'd be sent to go and learn your catechism. And one of the questions was, who made me, and then why did God make me? I'm trying to think of the answer at any rate to the question I'm thinking about is, God made me in the image and likeness, in his own image and likeness. Now, if you translate that into ordinary language, that's pretty, you know, sort of churchy theological language. If you translate that into ordinary language, I think it means every human being is precious. Okay, every human life is precious. Not my life's very precious, and yours is a little bit less precious, and these over here aren't precious at all. You know, I don't think it could ever mean that. It means every human life. No matter the colour of a person's skin, no matter where they come from, no matter what they do, no matter whether they're rich or poor, no matter whether they're in this country or that country, every human life is precious. And we don't live out that very well. We have news items where it looks as though if something happens to an Australian, that's very, very, very bad because they're Australian. If it happens to happen to somebody from, I don't know, somewhere else, Africa or somewhere, well, not terribly important because they're only Africans. You know, that sort of stuff happens all the time. So part of the Christian tradition is every human life is precious. I think another bit of the teaching, and I'm going to go briefly through a couple of these things. Several times in the church's history, the church has written authoritatively that justice is at the core of mission. Justice is at the core of mission. And justice is not just tit for tat. You do this and you deserve that. That's not the justice that we're talking about. The justice is the one that's in the Bible, that's in the New Testament and the Old Testament too. And that is, be good to those who are in need. Those who are in need deserve compassion more than anyone. And so you're seen to give back things that have been taken from someone, restore things to the person who really needs them, and so on. There's a whole long list of things we could talk about. I think that there are lots of statements that you can go to if you're doing your assignment in this area. Look at the bishop's statements over the last little bit about refugees in particular. There's an Australian bishop's statement that's very strong and very good. There's an Oceania bishop's statement. That's all the bishops in that area. There's the Papua New Guinea bishop's statement. All of those in the last 12 months or 18 months. And then there's the Pope's statements around, in particular, those people who are fleeing up to Italy and many dying on the way, drowning on the way in the Mediterranean. He's saying, look, we can't have this going on. We've entered into an age of indifference, a globalised indifference, if we let what's happening now happen. So they're all things that you might look at. And I think I probably have run out of time. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. Kathleen, over to you.
Yeah, sure. I'm not sure, is my voice projecting to the back? Can you hear me at the back? Oh, okay, great, okay. Look, I think what Ite and Jill and Bridget, Sister Bridget, have all basically enunciated, I would agree with entirely. I mean, universal values of mercy, understanding, compassion, human rights, they underpin all the major faith traditions. So there's nothing really new that I can add to that context necessarily, other than, I guess, fill in the gaps of stories or texts and traditions within the Islamic framework that support that position. So that's pretty much what I'm going to talk to. But I guess I would begin my sharing by saying that within Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, commenced his missionary, I guess, as the final prophet, as a person who had been strongly persecuted. So he represented a minority view of a minority tribe at a time when the elite were governing the township where he was. And from that very beginning, Islam and to a large extent, the Judeo-Christian traditions, the leaders or the prophets of these faiths were persecuted. So how they were treated, how they resolved and negotiated their release from this persecution goes to what informs a lot of the modern day communication and, verses and United Nations declarations on human rights issues as well. So there'll be a lot of similarities in how those are felt and experienced. And I think if we understand that so many of our faiths are centered in persecution, you would hope that this gives us causes as a humanity to turn the tide. And yet we're not actually seeing that translated, unfortunately, in modern parlance. So anyway, a bit of theory here. Like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Islam too recognises the right to find a family, the right to privacy, the right to freedom of movement and residence, the right to use one's own language, and the right to practice one's own culture, and the right of freedom of religion. The Universal Islamic Declaration of Human Rights, for instance, which is a document formulated by a group of Islamic scholars in 1981, based upon the values and principles of the Quran and the Sunnah, which was the life of the Prophet, states unequivocally that every person has the right to freedom of conscience and worship in accordance with his religious beliefs. This article in the Declaration has been influenced, no doubt, by the Quranic injunction that there shall be no compulsion in religion. And extending on that, on the issue of political rights, using the Quran as a basis, Muslim jurists and philosophers have also evolved a wide variety of